All right, we are now recording in progress. So first, I just want to welcome everyone on behalf of Kolami. I'm Rabbi Micah Streifer. I know lots of you, but I see lots of faces I don't know, so welcome. If we were here in person, we would offer you cookies and a warm welcome to the congregation, but you'll have to provide your own cookies tonight. But we are really thrilled to be able to gather this evening for what promises to be a really interesting program, the first of three sessions with Miriam Borden on what Tevye left behind, an introduction to Yiddish culture and language. So let me just thank the members of the Kolami Adult Education Committee, many of whom are here tonight, and for all of their work over the course of this year. This is in some ways the end of our program year, except for planning more for later in the month and next month. But we are sort of winding down a very busy and very full program year. So I'm just so grateful to have had all of these incredible volunteers led by Karen Pakin and Dan Burchuk. So thanks to all of you who have made all of our programming this year happen. We have lots more going on at Kolami, and I'll just say before I introduce Miriam that if you are interested in finding out, for those who are not on our mailing list, if you are interested in finding out about all the different things happening at Kolami, which includes study on a weekly basis, various kinds of learning, weekly services, trivia night. I'm not allowed to play trivia night anymore. I knew too many answers. Just lots and lots of really good things going on. Please do. I'll just put in the chat the email of our administrator, whose name is Marla. You can just email Marla and ask her to be added to the Kolami mailing list. We'd be thrilled to have you. So without any further ado, let me introduce our speaker for the evening, Miriam Borden. And so I can hand it over to her. Miriam Borden is a PhD student in Yiddish studies at the University of Toronto, where she teaches Yiddish language and culture classes. She leads walking tours of Kensington Market and translates Yiddish materials for the Ontario Jewish Archives, and has been a fellow in the oral history and Yiddish pedagogy programs at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. Currently, Miriam is translating the poetry of Shimon Nepal, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, the College Street streetcar conductor who was Toronto's most prominent Yiddish poet. And she's working on a dissertation about post-war Yiddish anthologies. So again, thank you to all of you for being here, and I'll turn things over now to Miriam Borden.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you also to the Adult Education Committee for inviting me to do this and helping me develop this course. It's been I've had a really fun time doing this, and I'm really excited to be here with you tonight. So thank you, especially given what a long season of programming it sounds like you've had, and the fact that, as the pandemic seems like it's sort of winding down, many of us are becoming what we in the Yiddish world call ausgezoomt, which means zoomed out. We are zoomed out. We are ausgezoomt. We're just done. So thank you very much for bearing with me for these next three classes. I think we're gonna have a really good time. What I would like to do, there are so many of you and it's wonderful to see the room so full. Please use the chat. I want to encourage you to use the chat function, have conversations as I am talking, as I ask you questions. I'll be asking questions throughout, so feel free, please, to answer the questions using the chat. Because as we said earlier, it's just a little bit too unwieldy to have everybody unmute. Be vocal in the chat. That's what I'm going to encourage you to do. And please introduce yourselves to me there as well. I would love to know who's here tonight. I would love to know a couple of things. Mostly I'm interested in knowing whether you come to the table knowing any Yiddish already, what your familiarity with the Yiddish language and culture is already. I would love to know that. So get that chat going, please. I would love to know if you have had any experience with Yiddish literature, Yiddish film, Yiddish performance of any kind, Yiddish dance. If you've been to festivals of Yiddish culture, I'm really interested to know, what the kind of, I guess, Yiddish exposure has been. And excited to sort of to get to know you in this virtual way. So please start writing. And in the meantime, as we begin to write, what I will do is I'm going to give you a little bit of Duolingo. Great. Studying Yiddish on Duolingo now. I'm so glad to hear that. That's great. It's really fun. I've been playing through the app myself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by just giving you a sense, an overview of what it is that I had in mind to cover, beginning tonight and proceeding through the next 2 weeks. It's called, the course I've called is What Tevye Left Behind. And that's an allusion. And the allusion is to, of course, the musical Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye, our beloved protagonist. And the fact that at the end of the film, at least, the stories too, and we can talk about the stories maybe a little bit later, because of course the musical Fiddler on the Roof is based on the Yiddish stories about Tevye by Sholem Aleichem. At the end of the musical, at the end of the film, Tevye and his family leave their shtetl of Anatevka and they go to America. We don't see them get to America. We just see them pack up and go tearfully. And the question that I sort of find myself asking every time I see that final scene is, what are they leaving behind, right? They're leaving a lot behind. They're leaving behind certainly violence, certainly anti-Semitism. That's why they're leaving. Poverty, absolutely. Isolation, a number of things. But what else are they leaving behind? They're leaving behind a whole lot. In other words, if they had stayed, if they had made their way out of the shtetl, they would have experienced an explosion of Yiddish culture. The end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century was full of impassioned debates about Jews and modernity and how they fit together, how they did not fit together, how to be a Jew in the modern world, what that even meant. Jews being this ancient people in a thoroughly modern world. How do these two things mesh, and where do they clash? What are the tensions? There was avant-garde literature. There was experimental art theater. There was really experimental poetry. There was popular music, traditional folk song, hundreds of newspapers in Warsaw alone, and an incredibly diverse political spectrum where whatever your political leanings were, there was a spot for you in this interwar years. I'm talking about the 1920s, the 1930s in Eastern Europe, mostly in Poland at this point, but Russia too, of course. Russia had its, the new Soviet Union presented all sorts of opportunities for Jews, at least in the beginning, and we'll talk about that next week. The point is that we have rapid changes. Modernity hits Europe, and it hits Europe hard. It hits Europe fast. We have this incredible range of changes that are difficult and that are radical, especially for Jews. And we'll talk about that in a minute, why especially for Jews. We have World War I redraws the map of Europe. And this is a map that, as I'm going to talk about in just a minute, this is a map that had been redrawn constantly throughout the 19th century and continues to be redrawn in the 20th, as we well know, not just with one war, but with two world wars, right? And the 1880s, which is where our story really begins, till about the late 1930s, which is not exactly where our story ends, but it's the high point of our story. It's a period of massive radical change for all Europeans. And for Jews, it's a period of time that's going to alter the course of history in unimaginable ways. And Yiddish is very much a part of that story. So what I want to do in these 3 sessions, I would like to introduce you to modern Yiddish culture. We're going to start tonight with literature, and I will explain why our entry point is literature. I have a good reason, trust me. We'll discuss the origins of the Yiddish language at some points. We'll talk about the formation of Ashkenazi Jewish culture, how Poland became the largest Jewish center in Europe, and this happens in the interwar period, and how changes across the continent created the context for this development of this modern Yiddish culture that I've been alluding to. It's a radical refashioning of Jewish identity and a reconsideration for Jews of their place in the world. So with that, I want to get right into it. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, you should be able to see this now. Give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Okay, thank you very much, Karen. Okay, excellent. Thank you, thank you. Okay, what have you left behind? I want to get right into it. I want to start right up. Shalom Aleichem. Ich heiss Miriam. Wie heißt du? This is how you introduce yourself in Yiddish for those of you who are not familiar. Shalom Aleichem. Hi, how are you? And the response, Aleichem Shalom. And you can try this on your end as we, Shalom Aleichem. The response, Aleichem Shalom. And you can say, my name is, you can say, ich heiss so-and-so, which means I'm called so-and-so. Ich heiss Miriam, my name is Miriam. Wie heißt du? What are you called? What is your name? If you're talking to a group of people, it's wie heißt ihr. Yiddish has the informal second person singular you and the formal. So ihr is the formal, or for a group of people. So I would ask all of you tonight, wie heißt ihr, if we had the time. Luckily I can see your names in the chat. So Shalom Aleichem, my name is Miriam, wie heißt du? And then the all important question, was machst du? Was machst du? Or was macht ihr? How are you all doing, right? How are you doing? Was machst du? It means, what do you make? There are a number of answers to this. The answers are below. Good. That's one answer. It's not a very Yiddish answer, and I'll explain why in a second. Schlecht. Bad. Not good. Schlecht is bad. Nicht kosher means, I'm all right. Not terrible. Not terrible. I'm muddling through. And Baruch Hashem, if things are really going great. Now, why wouldn't you say gut? And this is going to be sort of our entry point into kind of what I call the Yiddish mindset, right? The mindset of a Yiddish speaker. Why wouldn't you answer with gut or schlecht? And why instead might you answer the question with Baruch Hashem, praise God? If something's going well. If something's not going so well, you might say, oi, frag nicht, which means don't ask. Frag nicht, don't ask. Why wouldn't you answer the question directly, in other words? Why would you give such an indirect answer? Because of the ayin hara, the evil eye. You don't want to, God forbid things are going too well, you don't want the evil eye should come and take that away from you. So you never answer, a Yiddish speaker would really never say, yeah, good. Not really. That's our North American, our very happy-go-lucky, optimistic North American way of talking. Yeah, doing well. No. You say Baruch Hashem, or Nicht kosher, or to follow the format of Was machst du, which is how are you? Ich mache leben, which means I'm making a living. It's a good way to say I'm doing okay. I'm doing all right. Ich mache leben. So there are a number of ways to answer this question. Some of them you can answer with a joke. You can answer indirectly. Of course, you could answer directly. There's nothing really wrong with that. But yeah, I hope that sort of gives you a sense of the Yiddish speaker is always worried about the evil eye. Doesn't want to seem like they're doing too well, lest someone who's not doing as well feel somehow less than, and a constant refrain, Baruch Hashem, praise God, because everything comes from what they call the Eibishter, the Eternal One. So this is the mindset we're sort of stepping into tonight. Oh, you know what I'll do? I'll go. Ah, there we go. Full screen. Okay, here we go. I want to start with the shtetl and the concept of what is the shtetl, because I think it's one of the most iconic things Tevye left behind when he left Europe. It's also one of the greatest inspirations for the development of Yiddish culture, of modern Yiddish culture, I should say, which, like I said, is something that really begins in the 1880s with the development of modern Yiddish literature and goes until the Second World War, certainly, but even beyond that. It's one of the greatest sources of inspiration because it is something that writers, artists, poets, singers, actors, activists, ideologues, politicians, it was an idea. The shtetl was an idea that they could both work with and work against. What do I mean by that? Before we get into that, what is a shtetl? And I want to give you a few examples that all come from various sources in different languages that define what a shtetl is. And we're going to see certain common themes, but also some variation. So it's a little city, a small town, a village, in particular, the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, where the Ashkenazim flourished before World War II. It's also a term for a small town or a large village, even a Jewish neighborhood in Central Europe before the World War, inhabited by between 1,000 and 20,000 people. These shtetls were located in Poland, Belarusia, Lithuania. The principal language spoken, Avada, of course, was Yiddish. During the Shoah, many living in these villages were deported or killed on the spot, and these shtetls were destroyed. Okay, that's another take on what the shtetl is. Another one, the Yiddish word shtetl means an Eastern European small town that was formerly, let me, one second, I'm having trouble seeing my, okay, sorry. Now I can see more, no, I can't. I've got to, sorry about that, everybody. I can't see my whole screen. The Yiddish word shtetl means an Eastern European small town that was formerly inhabited largely by Jews. It gives a good sense of the unusually intimate feeling that our ancestors living here in these places felt toward their environment. East European Jews grew to love the world around them deeply, even though at times it was hostile toward them. And a couple more shorter definitions in Yiddish. It's a village in which the population until the Holocaust was predominantly Jewish. It's a small urban center that retained traditional Jewish customs. And the last one, as a rule, a small semi-urban environment, a small semi-urban type of settlement with a predominantly Jewish population in Eastern Europe in the historical period before the Holocaust. Okay. Using the chat, I'm wondering if you can give me some, what are the main points here? What are some of these themes that emerge from these various definitions of what a shtetl is? What are the main focus, do you think? And I'll give you a moment to think. I'll give you some questions to prompt you, actually, as you're thinking and writing. Who lives there? Who doesn't live there? Do we get a sense of what people do for work? We certainly get a sense of the language. Is it a village? Is it a town? Is it an urban center? We have all these things, these three things appear. So I'll give you a second. Okay, these two answers they're we'll get started with them. Oh, here we go. There's another one. Right. So we have it's a mostly Jewish world. We have the Jews lived in urban areas but segregated from the mainstream and mostly worked there as well. Yiddish is a predominant language, absolutely. Right, the flavor of the culture and the people, the tam, as you say in Yiddish, the flavor. Self-contained, absolutely. Vibrant, multifaceted, right. Right, the sense of intimacy, absolutely. Yeah, Karen, I've always thought of shtetls as small towns or villages with mostly Jewish inhabitants and Jewish institutions. Yeah, definitely. Something that I want to point out, if anybody here has ever been to Poland, um, there are shtetl you can still visit. Shtetl that did survive the war that you can go to and visit today. And what you'll see in all of them is that um, a church. You'll always see a church very either in the middle of the shtetl or really close by. So immediately, you have this sort of, you could call it like an intrusion of what we think of as non-Jewish life on the Jewish, and we think on what we think of as the Jewish shtetl, right? The shtetl was a really mixed environment, actually. Um, it was a market town, which means that we'll see what that means I'll show an example of what I mean in a minute. But it means you had people from all over, well, from the region, flocking to the market town on specific days of the week to trade and to purchase. And the Jews very much were a part of that market trade. Um, in fact, they relied on the market, sort of the nature of the shtetl as a market town to which people flocked and then left, right? And the people who came were often the peasantry, um, very poor. These are not cities where people are wealthy. Um, Sometimes you have modernity encroaching on the shtetl and sometimes not. And what is modernity? It's a train track. It's telegram cables. It's modern. The features of modern life. It's government. That's also the centralization of government is a feature of modern life. Sometimes the government was very much involved. Other times it was a very laissez-faire sort of attitude. But don't take my word for it. I want to give you some examples. But first, to understand the shtetl, to understand what this thing called the shtetl is, we need to go back to the end of the 18th century. We need to talk about the partitions of Poland. Um, for about 200 years, from the 1500s through the 1700s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was this massive portion of Central Europe, which was ruled. It came about because of a royal marriage between a Polish royal and a Lithuanian royal. They created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was a multi-ethnic, very diverse, at times religiously tolerant, at times intolerant, vibrant place. It was the major player in Europe of its day. In the late 1700s, the Prussian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, take advantage of the fact that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth has weakened politically, economically. It's in decline. They take full advantage of that. And between 1771, 1772, and 1795, over about a 20-year period, these three powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary, carve up the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and they each take a piece for themselves. So the colors on this map should help you sort of see the pink, and you can see how they chipped away at this over time. For example, this area over here was the first. Russia took this first. Then in 1793, they take a little bit more. Then by 1795, they take all of this. Russia gets the biggest piece of the pie. Prussia, first they start here in the darker area, then they move over here, they move into there. By the end of the 1700s, they've got this part too. And Austria-Hungary, same thing. I don't know if you imagine the map of Poland today as well or as not well as you know it. It is clear that Russia gets, along with their biggest piece of the pie, they get most of what is today's Poland. It's where most of the Jews are living. It's got the largest Jewish population, and it becomes part of the Russian Empire at the end of the 1700s. In the early 1800s, in the early years of the 1800s, I'm talking about 1804, and another in 1804, and then again in 1835, there were statutes issued by the Russian Empire. They're called the Statutes of 1804 and 1835. They delineate the provinces in which Jews were specifically allowed to live. And that's when we get to the Pale of Settlement. In Yiddish, it's known as Tchum HaMoshev. You've probably heard of it. This is where the shtetl, as we imagined it to be, is located, somewhere in the Pale of Settlement. And this map on the right shows you the lightest part of the map shows you this area that was the Tchum HaMoshev, the Pale of Settlement. It's obviously just a small section of Russia's territory at this time. It covers what is today Poland, parts of Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, and Moldova. Certain pre-existing Jewish settlements beyond these borders, if they were significant enough for economic reasons, were tolerated. So it's the borders of the Pale of Settlement were fuzzy, I guess, depending. You could always, there was special dispensation for certain people who worked in certain jobs, or who had, for example, if you worked somehow with the Tsar, you were often allowed to live beyond the Pale of Settlement. Most people did not have that luxury. And in 1815, Congress Poland, which you see over here, this little bit of Poland that was left after Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and Russia had their say, also became part of the Pale of Settlement. So there you go. That's all of Poland. And the Pale of Settlement lasted in this way until 1917, until the October Revolution of 1917, with the fall of the Tsar and one of those major redrawing of the European map that I mentioned earlier. A couple facts about Tchum HaMoshev, the Pale of Settlement. It's more than twice the size of France, so it is is a sizable piece of land, I suppose, not when you think about how many people were actually living there, which by the end of the 19th century, 95% of the 5.3 million Jews in the Russian Empire were living in the Pale. So it's home to about, I don't know, about 5 million people in this relatively small area. Within the Pale of Settlement, we have restricted movement and professions. Jews typically are only allowed to work as petty trade, artisan skills, merchants, shopkeepers, things like that. They're not allowed to farm the land, and this is key. Farming is not a feature of Jewish life. Agriculture is not a feature of Jewish life in general in the Pale of Settlement. The communities, the Jewish communities that really develop, and some of them thrive, you know, in this time in the Pale of Settlement, despite the fact that some of them thrive, they are characterized by poverty, certainly, and also a degree of self-sufficiency. The community bands together, social welfare. Tzedakah is a major feature of these communities. Making sure the rabbi has enough to eat, things like that. Making sure the yeshiva students are fed and cared for, because learning is very important in the shtetl. In between 1800 and 1900, so essentially, remember I said that the Pale of Settlement is established in the very early years of the 1800s, and it collapses in 1917. So for essentially the entire duration of the Pale of Settlement, there's a demographic explosion. The number of Jews in the Pale of Settlement increases by 5 times. So there's a very high birth rate, a very high survival rate of babies, of young children. Honestly, historians still don't really know. They can't really explain why that happened. They chalk it up to maybe this sense of community that was able to support new mothers, young families. It's still pretty unclear actually, but that's how it unfolded. So there's an enormous number of Jews crammed into this small area by the end of the 1800s. And like I said, shtetl life really is, it's a combination of what Yiddishkeit and Menschlichkeit. Yiddishkeit being Yiddishkeit, a sense of Jewishness, a sense of Jewish morality, Jewish values, and also Menschlichkeit, humanity, universal morality, not just Jewish morality, but a sort of universal morality, and this is piety, learning and scholarship, communal justice, charity, like I said earlier, social welfare. We see it manifested in the synagogue, in the home, the rhythm of the market, certainly the holiness of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is like a weekly holiday in the shtetl. The community structure, the family, all of these are determined by these twin values of Yiddishkeit and Menschlichkeit. In some shtetls, depending where they were, you have the encroachment of Hasidism. Some shtetls were much more Hasidic than others. In some, you have violence. In some, you have modernity. So there is a huge variation, actually. When we talk about the shtetl, we're not talking about a uniform, a place that was just replicated throughout the Pale of Settlement. We're talking about many places that each had their own character. They had certain things in common, certainly, but they were each characterized by something, slightly different. I also want to say that although there was high restriction of Jews living in the Pale of Settlement, they, for example, for the first half of the 19th century, Jews were banned from the cities of Kiev, Nikolaev, and Sevastopol. These are major Russian centers. Jews may not live in these centers for the first half of the 19th century, so that's up until 1850. Jews were not allowed to live in peasant villages in Mogilev or Vitebsk provinces, or in villages inhabited by Cossacks or state peasants. And as a measure against smuggling, because the Russian Empire was very concerned about smuggling, Jews were barred from building new settlement in villages within about a 50-kilometer zone of the empire's western frontiers. So there is tight restriction on where Jews are allowed to live. However, within the Pale of Settlement, Jews are allowed to move freely. So, which was not actually something that was afforded to everybody. Not all peasants, not all sort of castes were allowed to do that. Jews were allowed free movement within the borders of the Pale of Settlement. And like I said, although they are desperately poor, they have an extraordinarily high birth rate, which gives the shtetl a particular, character. Okay. So a couple more things I want to say before we get into, I want to show you some literature and I want to talk about some excerpts. I don't know if anybody had a chance to glance at the materials that I sent in our course pack. There was absolutely no obligation to do so, so please don't worry if you didn't have a chance. But hopefully after we're done tonight, you will look at those with fresh eyes and be able to really appreciate them on a whole new level. Some of the stories that I included there. So please do. I invite you to take a look at those stories after we're done tonight and over the next week, certainly. And to bring questions with you, by the way, if you do read them, to bring questions with you for next week. Because these are all going to be, this is cumulative, right? We're going to be building upon the next 2 weeks. We'll build upon this one. So I want to say that throughout the 19th century, so that's throughout the existence of the Pale, anti-Jewish persecutions, economic restrictions, and outbreaks of violence pressed really hard on the socioeconomic foundations of the Jews living there, especially in Tsarist Russia. While at the same time you have political and ideological revolutionary trends, right? You have these things bubbling up at the same time in other parts of the region, and movements, ideological movements, political movements. These begin to undermine the strength of the lifestyle of the shtetl, as people, for example, ideologically, they begin to think about immigration, they begin to think about Jewish nationalism, they begin to think about what it could be if Jews didn't have to live in the Pale. What about being a revolutionary? All these things begin, over the course of the 19th century to undermine the kind of the real strong foundations of shtetl life. And as younger generations were increasingly unsatisfied with the strictures of shtetl life, we see this. Tevye and his daughters is a perfect example of this. And then the October Revolution in 1917 dissolved the shtetl system entirely. So, and this has to do with the fact that the Pale settlement sort of dissolves at that point too, meaning the strict restriction on Jewish life, living, Jewish borders in that Pale dissolve, and Jews can move freely suddenly. So let me just take a moment. I want to take a moment and check in with the chat. Is it possible? Yes, Catherine, is it possible to obtain the reference package? Absolutely, yes. I would advise you, Catherine, to write to Karen. And I think Karen can take care of that.
Yeah, if you, Catherine, if you just send me a private message in the chat room, Karen Pakin, with your email, I'll make sure that you get the package. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, Miriam, so I can give you a couple of the questions that popped up. So,
please.
How many non-Jews lived in the Pale?
That's an excellent question. Certainly not as many Jews as lived in the Pale. I don't have an exact number. I can get one. You have to leave that with me. But certainly not as many non-Jews. Certainly not as many Jews that lived in the Pale. The Pale was not uniformly Jewish, but it was mostly Jewish. Peasants, so non-Jewish Russians, non-Jewish ethnic Poles, non-Jewish ethnic Ukrainians, because remember the Russian Empire sort of absorbed all of these places. Everybody was officially a citizen, or a subject of the Russian Empire, but ethnically there were differences, and certainly religiously there were differences. So we have a very varied population. Peasants tended to live agricultural lives. They tended to live in little villages. So the shtetl was more market towns, built up towns, right? There's not a lot of, it doesn't mean there's no field, there's no greenery, there is, but it's not agricultural. It's not these huge tracts of land, right, that you farm. So they did not exactly live, I suppose if there was a farm nearby, if it made economic sense, you would have neighbors who were non-Jews. Certainly not everybody was a peasant, and people lived side by side. Like I said, there's a church in almost every single shtetl, because these are market towns where both Jews and non-Jews flock every week. So the shtetl and its environs sort of they're really diverse, and they serve multiple purposes. I think certainly, if you had the freedom, if you weren't a Jew and you had the freedom to live in a place like Moscow or Kiev, you did. I think if you had the means to do so, you certainly did, especially as modernity really picked up and infrastructure, really developed. But it's a really good question, and I have to get back to you on that.
So this is my own question, and it actually comes a little bit out of that one, that your answer to that one. In terms of, you mentioned that Jews were not allowed to farm, but were they allowed to? But yet these were market towns. So were they allowed to have sort of market gardens where they could sell the goods that they grew themselves? Or when you say they weren't allowed to farm, you're talking about larger farms.
Yeah, they couldn't be commercial farmers, certainly because they didn't have the land. But and they didn't have access to the land. They couldn't own the land. They couldn't. But yeah, absolutely. They subsistence farmers. They grew what they needed, and they traded. They traded at the market for artisan crafts or at Tevye, for example, is a dairyman. Tevye, they're in the first or second Tevye story. He saves somebody. He saves a woman, a Jewish woman whose family is wealthy, and in payment, her father gives him a cow. So before that, he's kind of a Luftmensch. That's a good Yiddish word. A Luftmensch, a person of the air is what it means. Somebody who isn't makes a living however they can, doesn't really have a profession or a trade. So getting the cow, for example, for Tevye is like a major boost. Like now he can sell dairy because he's got a cow, So I think, yeah, it's it's complicated. Certainly they were allowed to feed themselves, Yeah, they found ways of feeding themselves and feeding each other, absolutely. Yeah.
So one last question regarding the communist revolution. Can you talk a little bit about the freedoms that it gave the Jewish people, and I guess did they quickly move out of these towns into the bigger cities?
So we're jumping ahead a little bit to next week, but I'll give you a sneak peek. The sneak peek is the Pale of Settlement, especially the areas that are now Ukraine, saw some of the worst fighting during World War I. So many of these shtetls, people fled. People just fled. And, who cares about the borders? Just flee and survive somewhere. Because these shtetls, many of them were on the front and they were just wiped out. So World War I took care of many of these shtetls in a violent and horrible and tragic way. So people just fled wherever they could flee to. But increasingly, what happens is Tsar Nicholas II, who becomes Tsar in the middle of the 19th century, is known for being he lessens some of these restrictions. So I should also say that the restrictions on Jews are not uniform throughout the entire existence, this 110, 115-year period. Things loosen, things tighten. It depends who's in charge in the region. The Russian Empire was notoriously disorganized. That's part of the reason pogroms happen, and we can talk about pogroms maybe tonight, maybe another time. But part of the reason pogroms happen is that there is just terrible organization, like what's the word I'm looking for? Not political, but legislative organization. It's just really, really badly managed. And so that's part of why the Russian Empire falls eventually. And so, yeah, it's not a period of total restriction all the time. It's more restriction sometimes and less restriction sometimes. And within that, people, found ways to survive and found ways to move around. By the 1880s, so by the end of the 19th century, Jews are allowed to live in certain places. They weren't always allowed to live. So Odessa is a place where Jews are allowed to live. There are other cities as well in Ukraine, today's Ukraine and Russia, where they begin to be allowed to live. And people who've had that younger generation that I described, the one that was no longer satisfied with the lifestyle of the shtetl, the provincialism of the shtetl, had already begun to move out of these places. And that actually, if I can move on from that, are we good to move on? Okay, I can't hear you, Karen, but I see you with a smile. So I'm going to take.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, it's a great segue. It's a great segue. The 1880s. It's a great segue, and the beginning of people deciding they've had enough of the life that I've just described. Let's just get right into it. I want to start by asking this: how do we know what we know about the shtetl? This is before film. There is photography, certainly, but you have to have a camera. This usually was more an urban thing. and you have to have a studio. So just how do we know what we know about the shtetl? I have an answer for you. Certainly, family stories. Yeah. But even more than that, because very few of us have access to people old enough to really remember the shtetl at this point. So family stories only take us so far. Art, absolutely art. I've got a picture here of Marc Chagall's rendering of the marketplace in Vitebsk, where he's from. And I'm looking at Jerry Lauderman's. My mother's family was the wealthiest family in the shtetl. They owned a large general hardware store, had employees and servants. My mother and siblings worked in the store. They also kept a cow and goats in their yard. I would venture to say that though they may call that a shtetl, it's a little different from the shtetl that we're talking about, which predates that one, right? It doesn't mean that there weren't wealthy families in shtetls. There were, certainly. There were wealthy families. There were poor families. There was everything in between. But yeah, some of the features of shtetl life do continue on to the 20th century. Absolutely. Because this is part of how Ashkenazi Jewish culture becomes formed. Carla. Yes, and Jerry also. Literature. Yeah, literature. Literature is actually our main source of information about the shtetl. And that's where I want to go next. I want to jump right in with one of the most iconic shtetler, and this is Kasrilivke, which is Shalom Aleicham's Kasrilivke. What I'm going to do is I will read these excerpts. I have a couple excerpts I want to look a little bit more closely at, and then I was going to say we will discuss, but really you'll discuss in the chat, and I will we'll do it together. Kasrilivke. The Town of Little People is one of Shalom Aleicham's stories about Kasrilivke. It's where he introduces us to it. I'm going to start there. The town of little people into which I shall now take you, dear reader, is exactly in the middle of that blessed pale into which Jews have been packed as closely as herring in a barrel and told to increase and multiply. The name of the town is Kasrilivke. How did this name originate? I'll tell you. Among us Jews, poverty has many faces and many aspects. A poor man is an unlucky man. He's a pauper, a beggar, a schnorrer, a starveling, a tramp, or a plain failure. A different tone is used in speaking of each one, but all these names express human wretchedness. However, there is still another name, Kasril or Kasrilik. That name is spoken in a different tone altogether, almost a bragging tone. For instance, oh, am I ever a Kasrilik? A Kasrilik is not just an ordinary pauper, a failure in life. On the contrary, he is a man who has not allowed poverty to degrade him. He laughs at it. He's poor, but cheerful. So the first thing I want to point out is that we have a narrator who's speaking directly to us, the reader, right? He calls us dear reader, the town of little people into which I shall now take you, dear reader, right? What he's doing is he's taking us by the hand, the narrator, and leading us into this mythical place that is situated within a real place, right? Kasrilivke never existed. It is a fabrication. It's a literary fabrication. But it exists within a real place, which he names the Pale, right? But Kasrilivka is something of a mythical town. And this is a tension that exists throughout, I would say, throughout Yiddish literature that addresses and engages with the idea of the shtetl. This tension between image and reality, tension between the shtetl and the rest of the world, the wider world, and a tension that we're going to see in the next excerpt between tradition and modernity. So again, this first sentence, the town of little people into which I shall now take you, dear reader, right? It's a literary frame. It's the idea that there is an author and there is a reader. I mean, that's sort of a given anytime you read a book, but here he's really he points it right out. He's not even hiding, right? We don't feel like we don't feel like there's an omniscient narrator who knows. He's telling you, I'm going to take you into this town. I'm going to be your guide through this little town, right? The other thing too is that there's an awareness from the narrator that people are reading about this town. That's how they're encountering this town. Dear reader, people are reading about this. That's how they're learning about what the town is in this literary mode. That's really important. Why is literature a good way to enter the shtetl? It has to do with the fact that the scholarly and the intellectual concept of the shtetl, which is the one that we're sort of talking about, and this version of the shtetl, the one that is sort of scholarly and intellectual and is trying to make a point. Shalom Aleichem wrote about this, as we're seeing right here. Yud Lamed Peretz wrote about it. Mendele Orchos Sforim wrote about it. Shin Ansky wrote about it. David Bergelson wrote. Everybody wrote about it. All of these depictions of the shtetl, these renderings, were intertwined with the real life of the actual shtetl, right? So meaning there's a distinction we need to draw between, this is not reportage. He's not telling us things as they are. He's putting his spin on it. The author's putting his spin on it. But there is a very there's a reality here that he is addressing in his own way, right? Part of what it was to live in the shtetl in the 1880s, when this story is being written in the 1890s into the 1900s, part of what it is to live in the shtetl is to read about the shtetl, that, as you're still living in it. Where these stories were published, they're not published in bound volumes and books. They're published in newspapers. They're published as serialized stories. So you got a different story every couple of weeks. And that's how people consumed these stories. And often you get a newspaper in the shtetl and you were reading about these fictionalized shtetls, even when you're in your shtetl, right? There's these two levels of meaning. So if you lived in a shtetl, being written about in these kinds of stories and reading about yourself was a part of what it was to live there, right? And that's why entering the shtetl through literature is such a useful thing to do, because it's sort of the way it happened. It's historically accurate. Reading fiction about the shtetl, participating in the fieldwork of social scientists who were coming into the shtetl to do research and collect notes, or encountering tourist visitors who live in the cities now but want to go back to the shtetl to visit because it reminds them of their grandparents or something, right? There's nostalgia there. That is part of what it is to live in the shtetl, and to read about yourself is part of, to read about this fictionalized version of yourself is also part of what it is to live in the shtetl. Especially in the years, certainly in the years between the two world wars, when the shtetl is no more, right? This story is a little bit earlier. I just want to, he tells you the name of the town is Kasrilivka. And how did this name originate? I'll tell you. And the answer is, it has to do with, am I ever a Kasrilik? Not just an ordinary pauper, but a man who has not allowed poverty to degrade him. He's poor but cheerful, right? And, it's interesting to me that how did the name originate? We're talking about origins. We don't really get a sense of the origins, actually. Where does it, we think about the origins of a town. How did it get its name? Who was the first person who settled there? Things like that. We don't get any of that. Instead, Kasrilivka sort of exists within history, but also outside of it. Like the origins of the name of the shtetl come from the people who live there daily, the Kasrilivkids, right? The Kasrilivkites, you could say. They give the place their name. It's not a place that is steeped in long history and is attached to that history. The place is almost incidental, right? Why is the place called Kasrilivka? Because it's full of Kasrilivkas. You know what I mean? It's sort of it's a bit circular, but that says a lot about imagining this fictional shtetl as something that exists in history and also outside of it. It's mythical, it's eternal, it's ethereal, the shtetl, but it's also of this world, but there's some element that it's also of the next world. And we'll see that in a second when we get to the cemetery. Okay. Here's another excerpt. This is only like a, I don't know, 8-page story. It's very short and there's a lot in it. Stuck away in a corner of the world, isolated from the surrounding country, the town stands, orphaned, dreaming, bewitched, immersed in itself and remote from the noise and bustle, the confusion and tumult and greed which men have created about them and have dignified with high-sounding names like culture, progress, civilization. A proper person may take off his hat with respect to these things, but not these little people. Not only do they know nothing of automobiles, modern travel, airplanes, for a long time they refused to believe the existence of the old ordinary railroad train. Such a thing could not be, they said. Why, they said, it's a dream, a fairy tale. You might as well talk of merry-go-rounds in heaven. So what is this? This is a scathing critique of modernity, right? High-sounding names, it's confusion and noise and bustle and tumult and greed, which men have, bestowed upon that, the high-sounding names of culture, progress, civilization. But to the people living in the little people of Kasralivka, that does not at all sound ideal. It sounds like noise and greed and, horrible things. And they seem to have an aversion to not just the idea of modernity, but all things modern, right? They don't know anything about cars. They don't know anything about modern travel, airplanes. They don't even believe in the existence of the train, right? It's not even that the train is an objective thing. It's a belief. They don't even believe in the train. So, the shtetl exists in the real world and also somehow distant from it, isolated from it. And that came up in the chat earlier. Somebody said isolated, self-contained. Absolutely. That's how this shtetl is being depicted. Remember, I must repeat, it's a fictional shtetl. It's a fictionalized shtetl where certain elements have been exaggerated for the sake of making a point. I want to go on. Shall I call it a beautiful little town? So here we get a description of the topography, right? Of the actual physical space of the shtetl. So far, we've only talked about the people. Shall I call it a beautiful little town? From a distance, it looks, how shall I say it? Like a loaf of bread thickly studded with poppy seed. Some of the houses are built on the slope of a hill, and the rest are huddled together at the base, one on top of the other, like the gravestones in an ancient cemetery. There are no streets to speak of because the houses are not built according to any plan, and besides, where is the room for such a thing? Why should there be a vacant space when you can build something on it? It's written that the earth is to be inhabited, not merely to be gazed at. So here you get a sense not only of the way Kasralivka is laid out, but the mindset of the people who live there, right? There's space, build something. There's Jews who need a home, build something, Forget about public parks and green space. No. That's not what this kind of place is. It's dense. It's like a loaf of bread thickly studded with poppy seed. It's dense. It's packed. A very interesting image, right? That the houses are so close together. They're like gravestones in an ancient cemetery. And in a minute, we'll look more closely at the cemetery. The cemetery plays a major role in the imagination of Kasralivka. It's dense, it's overpopulated, it's self-enclosed. That's the image that we're getting from this. And then he says, and then in the center of the city, there is a wide half circle, or perhaps it's square, where you find the stores, shops, market stands, stalls, and tables. There, every morning, the peasants from the surrounding countryside congregate with their produce, fish and onions, horseradish, parsnips, and other vegetables. They sell these things and buy from the little people other necessities of life, and from this the Kasralivkites draw their livelihood. A meager one, but better than nothing. And in the square also lie all the town's goats, warming themselves in the sun. So the market is the only point of contact with the outside world in this little shtetl. The Jews are dependent on the peasantry are dependent on the Jews. There's this mutual dependency. So although in this story, the author insists that Kasralivka is isolated and self-contained and somehow distant from the real world, it isn't really, not at all, right? It is very much in contact with the real world at specific times and specific places, right? Like the Kasralivkites decide when and where, and it's on market day in the market square. Okay. And here's, this is maybe the richest, this is toward the very end of the story, and this is one of the richest parts. But the real pride of Kasrilivke is her cemeteries. This lucky town has 2 rich cemeteries, the old and the new. The new one is old enough and rich enough in graves. Soon there will be no place to put anyone, especially if a pogrom should break out, or any of the other misfortunes which befall us in these times. But it is of the old cemetery that the people of Kasrilivke are especially proud. This old cemetery, though it's overgrown with grass and with bushes and has practically no upright headstones, they still value as they might a treasure, a rare gem, a piece of wealth, and guard it like the apple of their eye. For this is not only the place where their ancestors lie, rabbis, men of piety, learned ones, scholars, and famous people, including the dead from the ancient massacres of Khmelnytsky's time, but also the only piece of land of which they are the masters, the only bit of earth where they own, where a blade of grass can sprout and a tree can grow, and the air is fresh and one can breathe freely. What a fascinating description of a cemetery. What does it mean, for example, up here, where he says the new one is old enough and rich enough in graves? What does it mean for a poor place like Kasrilivka to be rich in graves? Why is the cemetery the pride of Kasrilivka? I'll tell you my theories. Here's my take. In Kasrilivka, death, you get the sense that death and burial are viewed not as endings, they're viewed as beginning. It's the beginning of eternal life, right? It's the beginning of history. It's the beginning of legacy, the beginning of memory, not an ending, the way we tend to think of it. They symbolize perpetuating life in these ways, not ending it. So Kasrilivka in life is a poor place, but in death, it's rich in that way. That's one element. To take this even further, in this passage, he mentions the Khmelnytsky massacres, right? This was a terrible massacre in the 1600s. Ukrainian Bogdan Khmelnytsky, anyway, terrible massacres. Many thousands of Jews were killed, and this is one of the sort of harrowing memories that defines many of the memories of the long memories of the people living in the shtetls. Because I should also say that it's not that shtetls didn't just like spontaneously emerge when the Pale of Settlement was established, when those borders were established. People were living like this in these little communities that were market towns. This structure had been set up as early as the 1300s. In the 1400s, the 1500s, people had lived like this for many hundreds of years because it made economic sense to organize the various regions in this way, around market towns, where people would come and gather and trade and then go back. And so Jews and non-Jews had been living sort of like this for a long time. So it's not, if I give you the impression that shtetls just spontaneously emerge, that's not true. So they have very long memories, the people living there. So yeah, the Khmelnytsky massacres. The pride and joy of Kasrilivkites is this history, this long memory that they all share. That is evident in the overgrown grass and bushes and the overturned headstones, right? That's where that history is kept. That's where the history lives. And Khmelnytsky, the thing that I guess the legacy of Khmelnytsky is the survival. Yes, it's death and destruction, but it's also the fact that so many of these shtetls survive despite Khmelnytsky's massacres. So survival is really integral to the sort of communal memory of the place. This is a place that has survived and will continue to survive, no matter come what may. It's integral to their identity. And then I want to think also about, what is the cemetery? If the cemetery is the pride and joy of this little town, what does that say about these people's attitude toward change, toward progress, right? The source of their pride is the cemetery, which never changes, right? And as we saw, they find modernity ridiculous and unbelievable. It's because they don't live in a world where change brings anything but more history. Change brings all kinds of things. It brings bad, it brings good, it brings more history. So they really live in that historical space, in that space of memory and the past. And it's another feature of the shtetl in general is it's a temporary, stopping. It's a temporary break on the path to messianic redemption. One day, Mashiach will come, and but until then, we live in Kasrelivka. It's a temporary stop that exists within this much more kind of complicated messianic divine worldview. But for the time being, memachta leben, right? We make a living in these little places. What is really important, the Haskalah. I want to talk for a second about, we're getting to the end here because I do want to leave some time for discussion and questions. The Haskalah is really important for understanding this particular image of the shtetl, all the ideas that I've brought to you tonight. The Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, it's called. It was an ideological movement. It was one response to modernity, a Jewish response to modernity, and it had these sort of twin pillars. The Haskalah. The idea was to preserve Jewish distinctiveness. That Jewish distinctiveness was elemental to what it was to be a Jew. There was a movement to the Maskilim, the people who were proponents of the Haskalah. They wanted to revive Hebrew, the Hebrew language. They found that to be this is the marrow of our people, is the ancient language, the biblical language. Revive Hebrew, but expand Hebrew, use it for secular use in newspapers and literature. Develop a real literature in Hebrew. And they did. And they had newspapers and they had literature. Very few people read them because there weren't that many. They were sort of preaching to the choir, right? These are all intellectuals, the Maskilim. The other thing was to integrate Jews into European society. So this is the twin pillar, right? On the one hand, you have maintain Jewish distinctiveness, uphold and develop the Hebrew language, make a literature out of Hebrew. Literature was one of the defining pillars of culture in 19th century Europe, right? On the other hand, the Haskalah advocated integrating Jews into European society, making Jews Europeans, to promote the study of European languages, culture, history, to take on European dress, to look European, to crop your beard, not to let it grow, to crop your beard, to cut your hair in a European style, to dress appropriately. This was really important to them. Also to promote economic productivism among Jews. So the idea that, it is the goal of society to become economically, viable. And that's kind of what they believed in, that Jews were somehow sort of outside of this system because of the restrictions, the longstanding restrictions. So the idea was to kind of get Jews out of this this backward, they called it, this backward, pre-modern lifestyle and mindset. That was sort of the goal of the Haskalah. Why do I tell you this? Because the writers, the ones who crafted this imaginary vision of the shtetl that has been so influential in today, in contemporary Jewish memory, in Jewish history, in Jewish culture, all of them started out as maskilim. So the Haskalah is very important for that reason. Mendele Mochas, whose real name was Sholem Yankov Abramovich, Sholem Aleichem, whose real name was Solomon Rabinovich, Yud Lamed Peretz, who didn't have a pen name, who just called himself Yud Lamed Peretz. They were all contemporaneous. They all knew each other's work, read each other's work. They didn't all get along. They all had a different perspective, a different take on how to portray the shtetl and why, and for what, and to what end. Mendele Mochas Sfarim, this one on the left, was a real maskil. I should also say, ironically, these are what we call the klassiker, the classics, the classic Yiddish writers. These three, all of them began not as Yiddish writers. They began as Hebrew writers. Each one of them, they had ambitions to be Hebrew writers. Why? Because of that pillar of the Haskalah, to revive, Hebrew and let it blossom and develop a literature and a poetry. So they all wrote in Hebrew unsuccessfully. couldn't make a living from it, and eventually turned to Yiddish. Yiddish, I should also say, was despised by the masculine. They found it to be coarse. They found it to be a bastardized version of German. They found it to be vulgar. They called it a jargon, which is a jargon. It was a very low form of language. They thought it was uncouth, uncultured. It just smacked of Jewish provincialism, everything they were trying to, get the Jews to move away from. And yet, all three of these men end up writing in Yiddish. Why? Because eventually two things happen. They begin to see that the Haskalah, the dream of integrating Jews into Europe as Europeans who are fully emancipated Europeans, treated just like every other European citizen. Mendel Forum is one of the first, you see this actually in his writing. He's a satirist. He begins, satire tends to be very political. He begins with these very didactic, very political stories where it's obvious, what the right decision is, and the right decision is to, shirk the burden of being one of these provincial Jews and become part of, modern society. You begin to see, even in his writing, he changes his mind, and he begins to see that by the end of the 1800s, it's very clear. We have in 1881, 1882, this wave of pogroms following the assassination of the Tsar, which is blamed on the Jews. Terrible waves of violence, and for the first time, not for the first time, this is the last time, Jews and Jewish leaders begin to say, you know what? This is not working. This is not going to happen. This dream we have of integrating seamlessly and them accepting us is not going to happen. Mendel Forum begins to come to that conclusion himself. Shalom Aleichem comes to that conclusion himself. Yud Lamed Peretz certainly comes to that conclusion. And they write in Yiddish because they realize this is how they're going to reach their largest readership. The people who are going to read these stories, the people they want to rescue, quote, so to speak, from the dregs of, provincial Jewish society, they're reading in Yiddish, they're speaking in Yiddish. This is who they are. And if you want to reach them, that's how you're going to reach them. The irony, the great irony, and maybe this is where I'll end for tonight, and we can discuss and I'll take questions the last 15 minutes. The great irony, of course, is that even as these people wrote about the shtetl, invented fictional versions of the shtetl, even as they went and took real data and did field work and collected folk songs and collected folklore and did census. Yod Peretz, one of how he started writing about the shtetl was he was sent there on a census mission to document the welfare, or it wasn't so well, of Jews there. The irony is that even while living there, they all came from shtetls too, right? And kind of emancipated themselves, grew up and saw the light and became maskilim who went and lived in the cities. But the great irony, of course, is that while living there, while visiting there, while researching there, the place that they are satirizing and the place that they are laughing at and critiquing, but also loving, they're documenting it. This is why I say literature is a really good way to enter this world of the shtetl. What they end up doing is documenting the shtetl even as it's slipping away, right? Because like I said, by World War I, the shtetl is disrupted by not only violence of World War I, but also the ideologies that follow, the revolution, Jewish nationalist ideals. These begin to disrupt the rhythm of the shtetl. And so the place that they are sort of satirizing and laughing at, but they're also documenting it. And that's how we access it today, mostly through what they leave us, through their legacy. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I would love to, I want to check in, and let's discuss, please.
Miriam, I have one question from the chat.
Sure.
And just wondering if you can draw any comparisons between shtetls and Mennonite or Amish communities.
Very interesting. I mean, there's that in the Frisco Kid, there's that scene, right, where he goes, Luntsman, and they have no idea what he's talking about, right? So there's absolutely it's interesting. Yeah, I think, Mennonites, Amish, we're talking about minorities across the board. Jews, we're talking about minorities who were ostracized for religious and, you know, political reasons from the larger communities in which, the larger societies in which they lived. And so I think, certainly, I think any minority community that is ostracized like that for religious or linguistic or you know, political reasons, but continues to, but persists and insists on its cohesiveness and its coherence. I think any community would have similarities, absolutely, definitely similar features. The sense, you know, the idea that the Amish have retained their language, certainly, right? The aversion to modernity, right? It's certain elements of modernity. Absolutely. It's a sense, I think I'm not an expert by any means on Mennonites or the Amish, but I would say that if there's something that unites, they're sort of contemporaneous, I would say. And so, like, with this moment of the shtetl that we're talking about. And so I think if there's something that unites all of these communities, is that they're responding in their own way to the challenges, the significant challenges of modernity, the modern world, and what modernity really demanded of people. In modernity, we tend to think of it as something, it's liberal, it's you know, it sets you free. Not necessarily, not if you're living in a totally different way of life. Modernity is an assault in many ways. Just like we saw in the story, it's noisy, it's full of greedy men, capitalism. These are things that are foreign to more traditional communities and need to be reckoned with in various ways. So I think the urge to kind of preserve your language, preserve your way of life is one response, definitely. And I think had history worked out differently, who knows? Maybe Jewish life today would look exactly the way Amish and Mennonite life looks. You know, who knows? Who knows?
Interesting. The 18th century Polish Hasidic garb that you still see in some cities, was that the traditional garb of the shtetls among the people who were not Hasidic?
Great question. No, Hasidim chose to dress that way on purpose in order to be distinct. So even they were distinct from the rest of the people living around them in the 19th century. You could recognize a Husid because of the way he dressed. And certainly there were certain things that, you know, that Hasidim were drawing on trends, right? There were also, like, in the Russian Empire also, there was like a way that Jews dressed. There was like Jewish dress. And if you Google this, if you look up Jews in the Russian Empire on Google Images, you should be able to find images of you know, Jewish dress, kaftans. It's sort of the way, it's Tevye's outfit from the film. It's baggy pants and it's boots and it's kaftans, little cap, similar to what the peasantry would have worn. They weren't so different in terms of the way they looked outwardly. But yeah, the Hasidim dressed that way in order to be different. So yeah, they were certainly distinct even then.
Thanks. So I would invite people, if you have questions, to either put them in the chat or to virtually raise your hand, and we'll pass them along to Miriam.
Looks like Susan has a question. I see you raising your hand like that.
I just wanted to revisit the issue of the land that the cemeteries were lying on, because I thought it was a very interesting point that this was the only land that the Jews were allowed to own. And therefore, in addition to the other reasons that you mentioned about moving into eternal life, it seemed to me this was their small little opportunity to have what everyone else had, that they had been denied for so long. So I just thought that was worth underlining because it certainly felt significant to me. The other thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if you're aware, but given your scholarship, you probably are. I just discovered that Shalom Aleichem's daughter had written a book about her family, and it's still available as a used book from Amazon. And I had the great opportunity to purchase it recently, and I found out, although you may not consider his lifestyle that of the enlightened European. I found out by reading this book that his wife was a dentist and that she worked from the home, and that he was often the one who would spend the time with their children. And when he had a new story, he would come to the children and he would tell them the story. And the way that the daughter describes this, it was in a very hands-on way. So when I think of him as being the author of Tevye and the tradition that Tevye represents and the shtetl, I compare it with this other side where he was so completely enlightened that he saw that there was something very high in being a father and in looking after his children and in educating them and making them feel that his work was also being shared with them. And to, again, have a wife who was probably busy a lot of the day, although I guess by working from home, we could argue she had great flexibility. They seem like an amazingly modern couple to me. I just wondered if you had had any exposure to that book or any thoughts about it.
I have not read that book. I'm aware of it, but I haven't actually read it. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's a great, another aspect of these are really complicated people. And I think that's another amazing aspect to consider, right? Of this one particular man. And I, you know, we only talked about Shalom Aleichem tonight, but I mean, we could talk for months about Megillah Rochas Sforim. We could talk for months about Yud Levin Peretz. There are many books written on both of them, and so many others, who were all very complex people. The thing about Shalom Aleichem, I don't doubt that, yeah, he loved his children, certainly, that he probably had adopted certain modern ideas about raising children. This is also the late 1800s and especially the early 1900s is when we sort of begin to think about children as not just small adults. Like, in other words, there's such a thing as childhood. This is like a new idea at the turn of the century, this idea that children should have different needs emotionally and cognitively than adults do, that they should be raised with a certain, there's a way to raise children that is not, they're not your employees and they're not your slaves. This is sort of, these are new ideas, and I don't doubt that he's influenced them by them. I also wonder, though, to be honest, if you read in the course pack, if you have a chance to take a look at the section called Londons, which is the letters between, it's the title given to, it's called an epistolary novel. It's a novel that consists of letters back and forth between Menachem Mendel and his wife Shana Shendel. Menachem Mendel goes to Odessa to play the stock market, which he really doesn't understand. And he's constantly up and he's constantly down and he just doesn't understand, and it's hilarious. And she's in the shtetl just going, "What the hell are you doing? What do you mean you're buying shorts? You mean like trousers? Like, what do you mean you're buying shorts? Just come home. Your children are waiting for you." And she just wants him to come back home to the shtetl, right? To Yechupitz. And it's hilarious. Take a look at that. What's interesting about that, those letters, they're a little bit autobiographical. He himself played the stock market, lost everything, did it again, lost everything again. So money was always a problem in the Rabinovich family. And this probably comes up, I'm sure it comes up in the book, that money was always a problem. I think he was out of work a lot. I know he died pretty much penniless. And so part of, I think I love the idea of Shalom Aleichem, the father figure raising his kids. I also think he was just out of work a lot. And I think his wife was certainly the breadwinner. And I think that definitely kept her busy, So I think it's a combination of things, But yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think it's, like I say,
Yes,
it's a great other aspect to consider for sure.
Yes, someone asked me for the title of the book, and I will bring that next time. I will bring my copy and show everyone if anyone else is interested.
Thanks. I have a question, Miriam. I'm interested to know what got you interested in Yiddish culture and history and the language?
Yeah. Both my grandparents are Holocaust survivors from Lodz. They spoke Yiddish in the house. They didn't speak it to me, but they spoke Yiddish with each other, and Polish when they were really mad at each other, which was often. They had a very thorny relationship, and they would swear at each other in Polish and speak in Yiddish the rest of the time. And I didn't understand any of it. And my mother grew up speaking Yiddish. She didn't really speak it to me so much, but I was like around it. You know, I heard her speaking it with her parents, and I had the sound of Yiddish in my ears. And what happened to me was that I went to university. I went to yeshiva my whole life, actually, and where I learned Hebrew. And then I went to university and saw that they were offering a course in Yiddish. And I thought, oh, that should be easy. I already know Hebrew. And of course, they're very different languages. And the only thing that helped me was the alphabet and some of the vocabulary. But yeah, once I started taking a Yiddish class, I because of the education I had, which was really focused on halacha and Gemara and Hebrew, it's like the Yiddish world just like didn't exist. And I found that when I discovered this when I was in university, I was like, wait a minute, there's this whole history that really explains so much of life today. I want to know what that history is. And that I sort of caught the bug, and I continued taking Yiddish classes. And I began to see that, essentially Yiddish language, through the language, right? Yiddish is the key to 1,000 years of Jewish history. Who wouldn't be interested in that, And so here I am today. I'm still interested.
Well,
10 years later.
We're glad you are. That's a good segue into thanking you for sharing your passion, and this has been very, very interesting. I'm really looking forward to the next two sessions, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and thank you to those of you who made donations to our adult education programs. Much appreciated. This year has seen a huge increase in the variety and number of courses that we've been offering, and we're going to be starting to plan for next year. We thank you, Miriam, for being a part of this, and opening up this Yiddish world to those of us who know a lot about it or a little about it. Much appreciated, and we look forward to seeing you here next week.
Likewise, thank you so much for joining me on this, what I think is a really fun journey. Thank you so much for your participation, your questions. It's great to have you along, and I'm looking forward to next week. Yeah, I applaud you as well. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
Okay, be well. Sei gesund, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.